Okay, so the continuation of yesterday, and the reason for that simply being is somebody was asking me a question about testimony, about witnesses, and it's actually in the parsha. It's at the conclusion of our parsha. So, and many aspects within Judaism they necessitate having witnesses in order for them to be validated. So let's discuss that. Let's try to understand. Let's think, for example, for a moment about a Jewish wedding, right? What is it? There are many parties involved in making a Jewish wedding what it is, right? What are they? There's the chassan and kala, the bride and groom, obviously, and there is the rabbi who's officiating, making sure the marriage is kosher according to Jewish law. There are the participant families, the various guests. There's maybe a party planner and chefs and waiters and a band for entertainment and you name it, right? The venue staff, people setting the tables and the valet parking. There's so many different components. But I want to challenge you, my friends, and ask you, what is it that qualifies the wedding? Because all of these things that we're discussing here are all important factors, But COVID has taught us it's very possible to have weddings without some of these elements. It really is. People have had scaled down weddings. People have had smaller events. They were all possible, but there are two, or call it one entity, but two components that if you don't have them, you don't have a wedding. Okay? People have gotten married under all types of circumstances. You don't even need the rabbi, but believe it or not. I get invited to weddings, and all I mostly get from it is fat. The payment for coming to a wedding isn't that great. But I do the civil marriage, and I oftentimes I've officiated many weddings. It's actually slowed down this year. But there are many ways for weddings to be officiated without the rabbi being present. Throughout history, weddings have taken place in ghettos and gulags and concentration camps. And during COVID, we've seen so many, quiet, quick weddings. But if you need that absolute bare minimum for a Jewish wedding, what do you think it would be? What is it that without this, no matter how good the food is, no matter how wonderful the band is, it's just not a qualified Jewish wedding? What might that be? Okay, obviously means bride and groom. Very good. What else?
The witnesses.
Absolutely.
And
Because without the witnesses, it is not a valid marriage. If that's right. The fact is that the photographer, the singer, and the rabbi all are not as important as the two witnesses to the betrothal. Under the chuppah, you need to have two witnesses to see it, to testify, in order for the wedding to be qualified as a kosher wedding. They have to watch. Now, there's two sets of witnesses. There's one set of witnesses that watches the groom give the bride the wedding ring, and we announce always to the exclusion of all others. Now, there's lots of people at the wedding. Everybody sees. Now, we need two specific witnesses, and there are qualifications for those witnesses that we've discussed many times in our shiurim. What qualifies as kosher witnesses, and they are necessary to establishing a Jewish marriage, to the extent that without them, there simply is no wedding. That's the basic law. Yes, we discussed in yesterday's shiur about, for example, citing the new moon. You also need two witnesses to cite the new moon, right? To say that they saw it. But the moon, it will be Rosh Chodesh, even if you don't have two witnesses, because the witnesses just tell you if Rosh Chodesh will be on the 29th or the 30th. We don't go beyond the 30th in Jewish law. Okay, so the witnesses, we understand, are integral, are vital to the importance of a Jewish marriage, to the extent that if they're not there, it's not a qualified Jewish wedding. So, of course, there are many other laws related to marriage, and today's shiur, believe it or not, is not about marriage, but rather about the witnesses. So, let's take another example of an instance where witnesses play an important role, and I could tell you many instances, but let's just use this example. For example, when it comes to a loan, lending money is one of those transactions that it's happening all the time, right? Businesses are constantly in lending, and there's borrowing, and there's buying, and there's selling, and there's mergers and acquisitions, and all these things going on. So whether somebody's borrowing money for business matters or for personal financial needs, Halacha says it is best to do this in the presence of witnesses. According to Jewish law, a lender could only bring a claim against the borrower before the court if they have proof of the loan. And unfortunately, there have been too many instances where people have had trust. They said, but he looks religious, and it looks pious, and it looks wonderful, and it looks kind. Don't let looks deceive you. Unfortunately, I've learned the hard way that sadly when it comes to finances, you need to have it in writing in today's day and age. And back in the times when we had the Sanhedrin and when a Jewish court of law was strong and effective, then the only way one can bring a claim against somebody who borrowed from them would be if you have proof of that loan. So you can have proof in writing that a person writes, although these days I could tell you sometimes people's writings and people's words of mouth, I don't know what's happened. I haven't lost my faith in humanity, but I've seen people make all types of pledges and commitments, and we don't see them come to fruition. So I guess this is what happens when you're in the people's business. We get to learn a little bit about people. And therefore, when it comes to something like a financial claim, you have to make sure you have it in writing, or as the Torah tells us in our parsha this week, another way is to have witnesses. Witnesses who are present at the time of the loan, who witnessed that this transaction happens, and they sign on the contract. It's not just good to have a paper, someone could say, it's forged. That's why you need two witnesses, two qualified witnesses. Without the witnesses, it's generally impossible for the lender to claim the payment in court because there's just no proof. So witnesses, again, are a vital part of transactions in life. Like we said, a marriage cannot happen without witnesses. And likewise, a loan is not guaranteed without the witnesses. And in fact, it's written in the Gemara, the Talmud tells us that it's forbidden to lend somebody money without witnesses. You should always have witnesses present. The reason the Talmud tells us this very simply is because I guess there were too many instances that have occurred where people lend, borrow, and then you have afterwards horribles. And I'll tell you a story that happened with a great rabbi. He was called the Rashash. What his actual name was, Rabbi Shalom Sharabi maybe, I'm not sure. But he was a great European rabbi. He lived in the time of the Alter Rebbe, the Vilna Gaon. He was a very wealthy man as well. And he was very generous and kind. Remember last week we talked about the idea of lending, of giving dignity. That was what the shir was about last week. But just to, obviously it's a top level of charity is to lend somebody to help them stand up on their own 2 feet. And one day there was a tailor in town who had an opportunity to make a certain amount of income if he were to get this business. But obviously to get this particular job, he needed to borrow money to buy the material. And he went to the Rashash. He said, Rabbi, can I borrow money from you? They arrange a date that the money will be returned. And I think they even had it in writing. It was written in the rabbi's ledger. The rabbi wrote everything down. He had it on his computer file, his Excel spreadsheet, at least the one of those, what they would use in those days. And this tailor borrowed the money from him. What happened was that the tailor did fabulously well. And although he was only supposed to pay back in 12 months, or whatever the term of the agreement was, he decided who needs to have debt on their head. And as soon as he earned the money, he went straight back to the rabbi to pay it back. Came one evening, the rabbi was deeply engrossed in his study. He said, good evening, Rabbi. He gave the rabbi an envelope with the cash. He said, thank you very much, really appreciate it. The rabbi said, have a wonderful night, and that was it. Well, the 12 months were up, and the rabbi's going through his ledger and sees, oh my goodness, this tailor owes the money. So he sends one of his people to collect, and he says, I paid the rabbi back, don't you remember? The rabbi had no record of this payment. This man was trusting a rabbi. I mean, who wouldn't trust a rabbi, right? This is the case of the borrower. So I'm showing you that this could go both ways. And sadly, the rabbi had no proof or indication that the payment was made, and he took this man to court. And of course, once the tailor was schlepped to court, he was seen by the community as a swindler. He's not paying back the rabbi the loan. The rabbi was so kind and lent him money so he could conduct his business. Everyone knows, it's public knowledge that he did very well in this business. And now he's taking advantage of the rabbi. He's not paying back. It was a publicly known case. This tailor was shamed. And unfortunately, he lost business. People weren't supporting him. And with time, he had to move to the poor side of town. He had no funds. As his kids were growing older, years passed. And nobody even wanted to marry. Who wants to marry the kids of this poor tailor who's a thief, there's a ganav, he doesn't pay back loans? Well, one day, the rabbi was going through his book that he was studying. Maybe it was a big book of Talmud. And he notices that in the back of the book, there's an envelope. This is years later after the incident occurred, and he thinks to himself, envelope, cash, what's going on? And he comes to the realization as he's going through the archives in his mind, he realizes, oh, that's the money that this poor tailor paid me. So right away he sends for the tailor, he begs his forgiveness, please pardon me, can't believe I put you through all this sorrow, through the pain, through the anguish of accusing you of not paying me back. I found the money all these years later. I'm so terribly sad. And the tailor does not grant any forgiveness. He says, look what you've done. You destroyed my life, my children, my family. I paid you back. And still, you took me to court. You dragged me through the streets. I've been dirtied. Anyways, back and forth. And eventually the rabbi came up with a plan. And then what his plan was, he says, you have a son you need to marry off. I have a daughters of marriageable age. Why don't we introduce them to each other? And if they like each other, everyone will know that indeed this was the truth of the case. I'll publicize it or let it be known. And that's what happened. Their children married each other, and the rabbi published the story. And that was the end of this story that happened to end well many years later. But just think about how many instances it doesn't end well. How many family foibles have happened because of money? How many stories have there been? So the Talmud says, don't rely on faith alone. What does it say on the almighty US dollar? In God we trust. All others pay cash. The Talmud says, let me share with you these words. It's forbidden for one to lend money, even to a trusted Talmud Chacham, a Torah scholar, without witnesses. Don't enter transactions without witnesses. And he says the exceptions are if the lender takes collateral, or even better, if he takes a promissory note. Whoever lends without witnesses transgresses the law, as the pasuk says. What verse does the Talmud use to say that you've broken a law? Lifnei iver lo site michshol. Do not place a stumbling block before the blind. Because you know how it goes. I mean, I'm guilty of doing it myself. I had somebody cleaning my car. I put $5 there to see if they're trustworthy. It was gone. We're not supposed to put stumbling blocks before the blind. We shouldn't be doing these kind of things. And the Talmud is telling us that if you don't have witnesses, if you don't do it properly, you're putting a stumbling block before the blind. Even a trusted Torah scholar, as in the story that I told you, a great rabbi from 200 years ago, who people read his insights. His insights are published in many books of the Talmud. He was a fabulously clever person, a scholar, and yet he still made the error in his accounting. So just as we have it in Jewish marriages, that we're saying here the witnesses are integral, are an important part of every Jewish marriage, the same thing we say witnesses play an important role in general aspects in life. But despite the importance of witnesses and their testimony to the laws, for example, when it comes to a loan, as we're discussing, the role in the lending process is very different than in the case of marriage. And I want to discuss the distinction, differentiate between the two. What's the fundamental difference between the two types of witnesses? We talked about marriage versus monetary. What's the difference? And this isn't just contextually, but in essence. And of course, we'll have to learn a lesson for life from all this related to us, not just in an academic perspective. But let's first talk about it academically so we can understand it. And we could go so far in saying that they represent two different types of testimony. There is one type of testimony we could say. It's called Eidei Kiyum. Eidei Kiyum are establishing witnesses. And then there is Eidei Birur, which is clarifying witnesses. There's a name I had for it in my mind, and I'm forgetting what it was. One is informational, and the other is transformational. Okay? So in this context, what are we saying? The Eidei Kiyum, the establishing witnesses, without them, they are transformational. Without them, there's no marriage. Whereas the Eidei Birur, the clarifying witnesses, you could still have a loan without it, just not guaranteed you're getting paid back. They are informational. They are clarifying. They are proof that the transaction occurred. So to establish means to actually effect, to accomplish something. There is no wedding at all without the Eidei Kiyum. Without these witnesses, there's no wedding, right? That's transformational. Eidei Birur, the testifying, the clarifying witnesses are informational. They are clarifying, they're telling us about something that happened, regardless whether the witnesses or not, the event happened. Okay? So that's, for example, in order to establish Rosh Chodesh in the times of the temple, they needed the witnesses to sight the new moon. But they weren't really transformational. They were really informational. They were saying that they saw the moon. The new moon appeared regardless whether they spotted it or not. And therefore, you would either have a 29 or a 30-day month. So I need to share with you a beautiful insight. Saw it in the teachings of the Rabbi from his rabbi, who he got smicha from, known as Rabbi Yosef Rosen. Well, he was known as the Rugged Shavagon. His name was Rabbi Yosef Rosen. He was a great rabbi in Europe, in Rogatchev in Russia, before the war. He was interesting to see pictures of him. He had very long hair. I think he was, as far as I understand, he was a Nazir, took upon himself not to drink wine, not to get intoxicated, not to cut his hair. They also say in general his hair was very delicate and sensitive. It was like deeply connected to his brain. And he was actually a colleague and friend as well, they say, of Albert Einstein. So they were friends in their youth. How exactly, I don't know the history, I can't tell you exactly, but the Rebbe got smicha, he got his rabbinic ordination from this rabbi. And he said as follows, the types of testimony include the type through which a thing is performed, such as a marriage or divorce testimony. Again, the same thing with a divorce. Cannot happen without the witnesses. On that note, you know the good old joke. What's the greatest cause of divorce these days? It's marriage. When it comes to matters of monetary witnesses, then they basically, the witnesses are serving only as informational, telling us that the event, that the transaction occurred. Okay, so perhaps you could say, I don't know if it fits in exactly here, but I once heard this little anecdote from Rabbi Shais Taub. There's two types of people. There are thermostats and thermometers. Thermostats set the temperature in the room. Thermometers tell us the temperature in the room or in the person, right? So, Rabbi Taub was talking about in general about life, that we should be, thermostats. We shouldn't just be thermometers. We should be setting the temperature. We should bring the warmth. We should bring the good attitude. We should bring the joy into the room. We should be thermostats. But in this instance, I'm just applying it the other way. The thermostat, without these witnesses, there is no marriage or divorce. Whereas in the loan instance, they're just clarifying that it happened, right? So they don't create the loan. They don't give it force with their presence. Their role is just as proof that the loan has taken place. If at some point in the future the loan is called into question, then these are the witnesses who will be called in, who will appear before the Beis Din, before the court. They will affirm its truth, its veracity. They'll clarify that they saw that Reuven lent money to Shimon or whoever it was involved. And because the witnesses to a loan are just a debir, they're just clarifying witnesses, a loan is still binding even if there's no witnesses, right? If somebody lends to another, you still have to pay back even if nobody saw. Obviously, the Talmud is telling us that there are human frailties. We know that as human beings, sometimes, sadly, people get greedy. That's why the Talmud says we shouldn't lend without money. But it's not a biblical law that you're not allowed to lend money without witnesses, right? But it is a law that you can't get married without witnesses. If a person borrows and there's no witnesses, or whether there are or aren't witnesses, if they don't pay back, they're a thief, right? Regardless of the witnesses. But when it comes to marital law, the role of the witnesses is very different. They're not just clarifying, they're not a debir, they're establishing. They are the thermostats. Without them, there's no temperature, there's no marriage. Their presence, the invitation of we said it before, you could have a wedding without a band and without an orchestra and without flowers and without a caterer and without all those things. You get married right here in this room. But you need those witnesses for the marriage. So that's the basic difference. Okay? In a very real sense, these witnesses are creating the marriage, and the monetary are just testifying that it occurred. All right, where did I want to go with all this? We have to let's try to take it a little bit further. Okay, let me just quickly look at my notes. What I wanted to tell you. I'm getting a little bit lost here. So, in general, both these types of testimony, whether it's informational or transformational, birur or kiyum, which means establishing or clarifying, they both are in our parsha. That's why we wanted to discuss this. Our parsha, Shoftim, it's in fact tomorrow's reading in Shishi. It has one of the sources where the Torah tells us the laws of testimony. And let's read it in the verse itself. Chapter 19, verse 15. What does it say right here? La yakum eid echad beish l'chol avan. A single witness cannot establish incrimination for any sin, for any l'chol chatas, or any infringement. Ashayachta, that a person has transgressed. Al pi shnei edim, al pi shloisha edim yakum davar. A sin can only be established by 2 or 3 valid witnesses. So there are certain things that can be done with one. It skips my mind right now, but we just learned it this week. So it's actually in the parsha here. Here, al pi eid echad. Where is it? It's in our parsha. Here we go. Now here it says not by one witness. Okay, I'll have to just find it where it is, but it's in our parsha here. It's just skipping my head what can be established by one witness. But the point is, this verse that we just read here, verse 15 of chapter 19 in our parsha, this is the primary source for the requirement to have 2 witnesses in Jewish law. And if we look a little bit deeper into this, as I'm looking in the Chumash here, it's telling us within this, the 2 categories. Look at this. What does it say? It says, al pi yakum davar, that the matter should be established. So what is this telling us? When the witness establishes, in the instance of this verse, it's talking about a sin, not about a loan or a marriage, but it's talking about incrimination, right? There's 2 things we could glean from this. It might mean that the truth of the matter is confirmed by the witness's testimony. Okay, and the verse is referring to a day birur, clarifying witnesses, like we discussed alone. Or the term could also be yakum. Again, it means establish, in the literal sense that the testimony actively creates the case in question. They are the thermostats who determine. Without them, there's no marriage, right? So within the verse itself, we see that there's two types of witnesses. So the question we can ask is, the question I want to ask is whether testimony, and specifically clarifying and establishing testimony, whether it has broader relevance, what is its connection to us? We talk about it, we talked about Rosh Chodesh, we talked about witnesses in our previous classes. What does this mean? What has it got to do with us here? What lesson can we take from this? Everything in Torah obviously has lessons for life. And if we're talking about witnesses, what has it got to do with us? If Torah means teaching, then there has to be a lesson that this is for us when we're not in necessarily standing testimony to something all the time. Or perhaps, maybe we are. So we can understand the spiritual role of witnesses in Torah by realizing that each of the Torah's laws it's not just a law, but every law itself, every statement in Torah reflects a spiritual reality, right? Just as a body without a soul is an incomplete human being, it just can't exist. So too, we say that the body of Torah law is animated by an inner spiritual vitality. There's the body of the Torah, which is the law, but there's the soul of Torah, the depth and meaning behind it. The laws of witnesses, the same thing, no exception. Not only is there a spiritual definition of testimony, but the notion that the clarifying witnesses and the establishing witnesses means that there's a specific spiritual idea that it's not just about two types of witnesses in law, but two aspects that we could apply to ourselves, to our own lives too. So let's try to analyze what is the spiritual idea, the notion of testimony from a spiritual perspective. Okay? So there's a verse, we're going to read it in a few weeks' time in the Parsha. Hashem says, or this Moshe Rabbeinu saying these words, I'm calling upon heaven and earth to testify Hachayim v'hamaves, that God has set before us life and death. God gives us blessing and curse. We already referred to it in last week's Parsha Re'eh, where Moshe says Hashem gives you a life choice. You have free choice every day. Blessing, curse, life, death. Uvacharta b'chayim, but I encourage you to choose life. Okay, a parent, God is giving us choices in life, but says, listen, I'm telling you what you should choose. Choose it for yourself and for your children and for your future. You want life. You want to live. So this was an ultimatum that Moshe was placing before the Jewish people and telling us and urging us and beseeching and begging us to choose good, to choose life. But there's a lot of meaning to this idea. And I want to focus on the fact that he says, I'm calling the heaven and earth as testimony. There's two witnesses, heaven and earth. And we see in general, like if Hashem uses these two witnesses. So not just in a case of a marriage or of a loan, God's taking two witnesses, heaven and earth, to reflect the spiritual truths. And it's not only here in the Torah. For example, we read in the Haftorahs these weeks the prophecies of Isaiah, Yeshaya Navi. And he also uses this. He says, Atem Eda, you are my witnesses as Hashem, and my servant that I'm chosen. So again, we have the same concept where, witnesses, that God has witnesses. You are my witnesses, the prophet is telling us in the name of Hashem. Who is he referring to? So the commentaries, and this is something in the Talmud it's discussed, it says, we, the Jewish people, we are the witnesses. When God says, you are my witnesses, in Devarim, in chapter 30 here, in Parshas Nitzavim, it's referring to heaven and earth because it's explicit. It says very clearly, But in the book of Isaiah, where the prophet Yeshua was saying, "You are my witnesses," there it is, our sages tell us, referring to us. So we see that when God calls for witnesses, the first part of the guest list is heaven and earth, but we too are included. So of course, you're wondering, hold on, the prophet Isaiah talks about "you are my witnesses." What are we witnesses for? Right? What are we witnesses for? But, I mean, God needs witnesses? Isn't God infinitely greater than us? What kind of testimony could we offer for God? So what's the role of being God's witnesses? And what about heaven and earth? Right? What are we all testifying about? What are we all testifying for? What is the purpose of being God's witness? So in Likutei Torah, which is a compilation of teachings from the Alter Rebbe, he talks about this, and he says that, I guess just here's the verse where it says that you are my witnesses, right? God himself uses heaven and earth and us as witnesses. What's the significance? What is the meaning behind this? Let me share with you something that is written in Likutei Torah. The Alter Rebbe says that it's a metaphorical witness for what do we need to be witnesses and testimony. So sorry, I'm going to be quickly translating aloud from the Hebrew readings that I have in front of me. He says, a trusted pronouncement to what's hidden, what's concealed from the public. For something that's revealed, you don't need testimony, he says. But even if it's something that's not yet known, but it can immediately be learned if people see it, then no testimony is necessary. Just a few more lines. He says, with regard to the godly energy that's invested within the worldly reality, that is considered to be integrated. It's something that everybody sees. So he says, for that we don't need testimony. Now, listen, this is getting a little bit deep. But he says there are hidden matters in the world, or hidden worlds. I don't know how do you translate this properly, if it's hidden matters in the world or hidden worlds. But the point is, this is Alma de Iskalia, the hidden world. Alma de Iskalia is the revealed world. But then he talks here, Alma de Iskasia, the hidden world. And what he's saying is that in the hidden world, there are things that are beyond our perceivable realm. In fact, the Talmud tells us everything we have on earth, we have in the sea, in the ocean. And, all types of vegetation and growth and animal life. But in the sea, it's hidden. Whereas on earth, it's revealed. So the idea, perhaps, that he's telling us here, we'll have to try to dissect this and analyze it together, is that we are testifying to the hidden matters. So he's sort of defining testimony in spiritual terms. That something that's revealed doesn't need testimony, but that which is hidden does. So at a very simple level, the way I'm understanding it is that the witnesses in a courtroom are serving as proof. They're verifying that something took place, right? It's not known to the court. The judges don't know. That's why you have witnesses. Because otherwise, how's the judge supposed to know what happened? Did this person lend money to the other? Didn't they? Well, we have witnesses who've seen it. So the witnesses are coming and revealing the truth that this loan did indeed occur because we were there. We saw it. Okay, that's the clarifying, that's Eidei Birur, clarifying witnesses. But if something's obvious to the court, they don't need witnesses to testify. Right? You don't need somebody to tell us that the sun rises each morning. It's obvious. Anyone who denies that is a lunatic, is crazy. So, in an instance where something's known, witnesses aren't necessary. Now, trying to unpack this. God calls upon heaven and earth in the Chumash, in our book of Devarim. As we know, this means that their job is to reveal what otherwise cannot be known. Obviously, then, God needs no witnesses to tell him about the world, since everything is revealed and known before Hashem. So the question is, what about us? The reverse. God doesn't need, but what about perhaps the world needs witnesses to testify to the hidden truth of God? Not all of what is true about God is hidden. So the fact that there is a creator, the existence of God, according to what the Alter Rebbe is saying here, seems to indicate that we don't need testimony to that. Except, isn't that what Avraham and Sarah did? Weren't they revealing monotheism in the world? Okay, I'll have to get back to that in a moment. But the point we're saying is that we don't need testimony to the fact that God created the world. But perhaps the world needs witnesses to testify about God's existence. But then again, he's telling us that's too simple. Everyone knows. Right? You think, how did the whole world come about? Didn't just appear. In fact, in the book of Iyov, there's a verse that says, Va'achar ori nikfu zois umibsari echseleka. That from my flesh we could see God. Because there's just nobody who could create such a complex feature, a human being. There has to be, there's no way it can happen without a God. So this verse itself tells us, Mibsari echseleka, from my flesh I see God. That God exists. There's this verse itself tells us that from our own bodies we see God's existence, but there's a very well-known story that's told, I don't know if it's about Rambam or about another rabbi, but there might be a few such stories. I have to tell you two, because there's two that come to my mind. One, they say, again, I'm not sure if it was Rambam or another great rabbi, that he once met with a particular emperor, king, and he was asked, how do you know that God exists? So the rabbi turned to the king and said, like this painting, do you think it just happened by itself? I think he even spilled his ink on the sheet of paper to demonstrate his point. And he showed him, look at this book. All these words in the book, are they just self-written? They just come about, robotically? Of course not. So what the rabbi was trying to emphasize and to demonstrate to this king, the emperor, was that just as the book isn't self-written, all the rhymes and rhythms and the poems, you needed somebody to write it. This whole world cannot just exist by itself. The rabbi was telling the emperor and demonstrating to him that just as you agree that this painting didn't just happen on its own, but rather you or whoever the artist was worked so hard to make it happen, well, likewise, this world came into existence because there's a creator, and the creator made this world exist. There's another story, I don't know its source, but I was reading it to my kids the other day, so let me just quickly pick it up here on my phone so I could just share it with you. I just thought it's a nice, interesting story to share. It says like this. It's a story told about the Americans, the Russians, and the Chinese. They got together, and they decided to send a manned spaceship to Mars. They spent, I don't know, what does NASA spend? Billions of dollars. And the Russians spending their rubles and the Chinese their yen. And after years of preparation, the spaceship finally blasts off, heading for Mars. Maybe we even had a South African involved, Mr. Elon Musk, who knows, right? So, a while later, the astronaut takes a small step for man, but a large step for mankind. Who's the one that said that? Armstrong? He steps out onto the Martian surface, And there you have all the TV sets, the cameras beaming at him, every move as they're navigating the space there. And suddenly, after taking a few steps, the world is stunned by the sight of a can of Coca-Cola lying on a rock there on Mars. So the astronaut picks up the can. He sees it's the real thing. He sees it says Coke trademark, made in the USA. The Russians and Chinese are in uproar. The Americans had obviously deceived them. They sent an earlier spaceship. The Americans deny this claim, but they themselves are baffled by the appearance of Coke. Maybe it was a Chabad house on Mars and the leftover litter from the bracha, who knows? So the press comes interviewing the professor from Oxford University, who explains the conundrum by suggesting that over billions and billions of years, it's very quite possible through evolution that a can of Coke was formed, even displaying the words made in the USA. Of course, people laughed, right? Really? Even after billions of years of the mathematical probability of these words forming by themselves is nil. How much more so the creations of this world we have to understand, which is amazingly complex. We've yet to scratch even the surface of it. Even today, scientists agree that they've only begun to tip the iceberg of the complexity of this world. How could it possibly have formed by itself without a master architect, a designer? So we have to understand, of course, that we are the testimony. We are the ones who testify God's very existence. Imagine you go into a car factory and think that the cars are going to make themselves. How ridiculous to think that such a factory is not something. Everything has people behind it. There are people working and designing and creating, and there's teams and teams and teams. So just as the poem reflects the existence of its author, and the art is the representation of the artist, so the same thing as the world. It's obviously created by God. And all of this is not testimony, but it's readily available truth. It's known to anyone who's willing to look, to follow the limited world to a divine conclusion. But this doesn't mean that all of God's truth can be learned from the world. Not everyone and not everything is readily and easily discernible. So even though we could think and contemplate and we realize God's existence, but then and understand the nature of our Creator, that's an understanding of that God is. But what about who God is? What about understanding the depth? And in fact, it's a mitzvah in the Torah. V'yadatas Hashem Elokecha. We should come to know Hashem, our God. So, what is it that heaven and earth tell us about God that other creations do not tell us or cannot tell us? What is it? What is eternal in heaven and earth? Yeah, you have the sun, the moon, the stars. The celestial bodies continue in their motions for all of time. Now, I know there are certain stars that ostensibly die, and I don't know astrology and astronomy that well. Sitting there with my astronomer the other day, he was going on. We were at Pilansburg in the dark of night, pointing out the various stars and the Zeus, and this one's jealous of that one. Okay, all that stuff, and billions of years. But these are creations of God that stand the test of time. But we're saying is not just the stars, not just the heaven, but on earth too. And that's why God gives creations the procreative power, the potential to continue creating new generations of places, of animals, and us human beings. We continue that this is an expression of infinite power over time. And, everything, obviously with time, we humans, I saw dying elephants in Pilansburg the other day, and our guide, our ranger, was explaining to us, the elephants got a lifespan of about 70 years or so, but as they lose their sixth set of teeth, they begin to decay. They get weaker and they lose their existence. They lose their strength, their vitality. So it's our task, our job in this world, to testify to the nature of God. Not only is there a creator, but he is able to create things that exist, everything that exists in the world around us. And Kabbalah and Chassidus talks about this in great depth. So the spiritual witness of heaven and earth exists to testify to the infinite nature of God. Of course, we, Homo sapiens, and particularly as the Jewish people, also have a responsibility of sharing with the world our testimony. So what's the role of us as a Jewish people? What is it that is our task that we are called to testimony, as the prophet Isaiah says? And so, my friends, if we look at the different types of witnesses that we discussed, we understand that heaven and earth act as clarifying, Edei Bir, they're clarifying witnesses for God. Their testimony, God's eternal infinitude, that God is here and God created everything. But we go a step deeper. We establish, we are the transformational witnesses for God. To be God's establishing witnesses doesn't mean, God forbid, that the truth of God is created by us, but rather that within the world, the truth of God becomes revealed. Right? We discussed before that the world on its own already demonstrates God's existence. And the special witness of heaven and earth is conveying God's infinite nature. We have the role of combining the two, of transforming the entire world into a place of God's infinite presence. That's our task. We, by serving God, by fulfilling our purpose, our raison d'être in this world, we are able to, not at a distance, but in reality, to reveal God's presence in the world. Every time we do any mitzvah, we are revealing God's presence in the world. We're not just passively clarifying that God exists, but we are fulfilling the divine mandate. We are fulfilling the divine purpose for which we were put into this world. So every time we do that mitzvah, we are establishing God's presence in the world. Every time we study Torah and we do mitzvahs, we cause unity of the world within the divine. That's perhaps the reason why you say a wedding witness. They establish the marriage. We are like those witnesses. We create that relationship, our relationship with God. Remember, what does the word mitzvah mean? It means, besides for a commandment, it means a connection. So to draw God into this world, every time I do a mitzvah, I'm establishing that connection. I'm marrying God. Just like any wedding, the ceremony needs witnesses who don't just attest to seeing, but they establish the marriage. It can't take place without them. This world cannot exist without us. We are the establishing witnesses of the marriage of God and us. So, my friends, that is our purpose. We talked about two types of witnesses, the clarifying witnesses and the establishing witnesses. Well, I think this teaches us about our purpose, the purpose of creation in general. but about each individual, how we're indispensable to God's plan in this world. That each one of us is vital to the world's existence. So we can't just see our mitzvahs as commandments, but rather, with every mitzvah that we perform, we are establishing the purpose for the world's existence. We're being living example, role models for others to live an exemplary, good, proper, moral, ethical, spiritual life. And perhaps this is what it means when the prophet Isaiah says, "You are my witnesses." Because by being a witness, we testify that this world is not just purposeless, but every single one of us has a purpose in this world. So, yes, on Friday night, when we say Vayichulu, tomorrow night, we are testifying to the fact that God created the world in 6 days and resting on Shabbos the 7th. And this verse in our parsha telling us that a sin can only be established, anything can only be established with 2 or 3 witnesses, that's not just clarifying that something exists. What we are saying here, based on the teachings of Chassidus, is that we're establishing the world's existence. We are guarantors for each other, and we are guarantors for this world's existence by each one of us playing our role, doing our part, and inspiring and influencing others to do their part as well. And that's the point. We have to share our Judaism with our fellow Jews. We have to do what we can. We have to inspire and influence the world around us. If you think about the 7 laws for the 70 nations of the world, it's time that we share that, and we influence, and we indeed be a light unto the nations of the world. And thereby, we're actively testifying for God the purpose of the world's existence. With that, ladies and gents, conclude today's shiur. Any questions before we go? Thank you. What's the difference between Elokim and Hashem? Elokim represents Gevura, might, and Hashem represents Chesed, love and kindness, in terms of the meaning. That's certainly a very simple, a simple understanding, but absolutely, yes, if you want to go much deeper. And of course, the name Elokim is a numerical value, gematria, of the word Hateva, which means nature. So the natural world is Elokim, which is Gevura, which is also, it has the same numerical value as the word Olam, which is Helem, which is concealment. So the world conceals God. That's the way God made it. And the name of Hashem is Chesed, of course. So yes, there's a lot more depth to that. That certainly, that itself is very deep. The question about guarantor is Arevus. Yes, absolutely. We are Kol Yisra Arevim Zelazah. We say each one of us are guarantors, are Arevim, are the guarantors for each other. That's why we all bear responsibility in how this world exists. We all bear responsibility for each other's behavior in this world. Okay. Any questions? With that, we're going to go see you, please God, next week. You're all welcome to join us in shul tomorrow night, whether at our shul or your shul or any shul. Have a good Shabbos, everyone.